Have you ever thought of why God created the creation and why He created man? It seems that God wanted to reside with man and have a relationship with man, what we will call the covenant relationship. So there are two things that we can highlight here. God wanted to establish His presence among men and to form a covenant relationship with men. Now, if you look at the beginning of Genesis, Genesis 1 and 2, and just looking at these two themes, how they are shown, although they might seem that they are not clear from these two chapters, but we can look at them closely, looking at the historical background and looking at some linguistic clues. Now, let's start with this covenant relationship. Why would I say there is a covenant relationship between man and God? If you look at this word of covenant, it doesn't appear in the first chapters of Genesis. You only find it in chapter 6, verse 18, whereby the name covenant or the phrase covenant is used. Now, my argument is that if you look at chapter 6, verse 18, the phrase that is used in Hebrew is called Hekim Berit, meaning upholding the covenant. But one cannot uphold a covenant without initiating a covenant. So it is amazing how the narrator in chapter 6, verse 18 will just use this phrase and not showing us when the covenant was initiated. My argument is in two ways, historically and linguistically, in chapter 1 and 2, that there was a covenant or an initiation of a covenant. Hence, we will talk about the Adamic covenant. Now, this can be seen in the concept of the image of God. In the ancient Near East, when one talks about an image, there will be maybe three options. The image of the king in a statue, the image of the God as a manifestation of his presence in a statue, and thirdly, the image of the God found in kings or in kingship. Now, without looking at the first two options, I will focus on the third one, which is the view that I will take, that the image of God was found in the kings. Now, it is difficult to find any text, any ancient text that describes the people, or the people are described as the image of a god or of the gods. It's only one text that we are able to find called the Egyptian Instruction of Merikare, whereby all people are called the image of God. But what was normal or what was common in the ancient world, only the kings will be described as the image of the God. So we will take this view that is common, that kings were the image of the God. Now, in the Egyptian literature, the pharaoh was described as the image of the God, and in Mesopotamia as well, the Assyrian kings were described as the Tsamu, which is an Akkadian cognate of Tselem, which is the image of God. So the king will be an image of the god Enlil in the Assyrian text, and in in Egyptian text, the Pharaoh will be the image of the god. So this shows us that the term image, Tselem, or Tsalmo in Akkadian, refer to the king as the image of the god and also as a royal son of Enlil in terms of Mesopotamia. Now, since the king was this representation or representative of the god, then it was understood that the god entered into a formal partnership with the king. So there is some sort of partnership between the god and the king. And sometimes it is articulated through writing. Now, based on this historical understanding that the image of the god was the king, which is there was some royal ideology. Now we can look at the linguistic clue. Now, if you look at chapter 6, verse 18 again, whereby the word appears, the Hakim Berit, which is upholding the covenant, we can argue that in Adam, when Adam is created in the image of God, then God enters a form of formal partnership, what we can call a covenant. Just like in the ancient world, a king will enter into the formal partnership with the god after kingship has been established. So, if Adam entered into this formal partnership, which we call a covenant, now linguistically, how can we prove this? Now, in other places, especially in Genesis, there are these two phrases, which is the Hakim Berit, to uphold the covenant, and the Karat Berit, which is to cut a covenant or to initiate a covenant. We can see this maybe in Genesis 15, whereby in Genesis 12, when Abraham is called, there is some form of partnership or covenant. But in Genesis 12, it is informal. That covenant is formalized in chapter 15. In chapter 15, the term karat berit, which is to initiate a covenant, is used. And in chapter 17, the term hakim berit, which is to uphold the covenant, that phrase is used. So, even here, we can see that if Hakim Berit is used in chapter 6 and chapter 9 in the flood narrative with Noah, which is upholding the covenant, then that will mean that in Genesis 1, when God creates man in his own image, then it is implied that God entered into a formal covenant or a formal partnership with man. So we can conclude that chapter 1 and 2, when God creates man, he wanted to establish a formal partnership, a covenant with man. He initiates a covenant with man, whereby in chapter 6, he will uphold the covenant that he initiated in chapter 1 and 2. The second thing, as I said in the beginning, God wanted to form a partnership or covenant with man, but the second thing is that God wanted to reside with man. He wanted to be among men and have this formal relationship. Now, let's look at chapter 1 and 2, how God resides, or how this theme is shown in chapter 1 and 2. Now, in ancient mythologies, the creation was always followed with the building of the temple. The temple was built as a conclusion of creation, of the creation of the world. For example, in one of the Sumerian texts called the Temple of Kes, the temple is described as a house that was blended together with the plans of heaven and earth. So in this text, we can see that, and in other ancient texts, that the building of the temple seems to go together with creation. In other words, creation was not completed in the ancient world without the construction of the temple. Hence, in this Sumerian text, the creation was planned together with the building of the temple. Again, therefore, we can include that there is some temple theology in chapter 1 and 2, whereby after God created everything, he rested. And then in chapter 2, we see the Garden of Eden, whereby God has this communication or has this relationship with man, Adam and Eve. Now, in Ashur, or just near Ashur, there was a temple that was discovered which had many rows of 3 pits in the courtyard. This suggests that there were gardens that were adjoined to the temples in the ancient world, whereby food was grown to offer to the gods. Even kings will replicate this when they build their own palaces. They will have some garden next to it. Because the temple was seen as the throne of the gods, whereby the gods will come down and reside and be among men. Therefore, the Garden of Eden, with the fruits or the trees that are around, suggest this theme of having the temple with the garden. And again, in the Egyptian and Mesopotamian stories, the 7-day inauguration of the sacred space is also found, which shows that the creation of the world in 7 days, the point was to inaugurate this sacred space so that God may reside with man and have this relationship or this formal partnership. Now, one of the things that was that was considered in the ancient world is that order and wisdom resided with the deity. Therefore, the deity's presence in the temple, and remember that in that world, the deity's presence will be seen in the statue that is located in the temple. Therefore, the deity's presence in the temple made it the center of order and wisdom in the world. Therefore, these two things can be seen in Genesis 1 and 2. And I believe that the greater theme will be God residing with man, God establishing his presence with man. And then, after establishing his presence, he enters into the formal partnership or a formal covenant. And this will be seen right through the Old Testament.